As a longtime grassroots environmental activist, and as a creature living in the thrashing endgame of civilization, I am intimately acquainted with the landscape of loss, and have grown accustomed to carrying the daily weight of despair. I've walked clear cuts that wrap around mountains, drop into valleys, and climb ridges to fragment watershed after watershed. And I've sat silent near empty streams that 2 generations ago were lashed into whiteness by uncountable salmon coming home to spawn and die. I began to feel pretty apocalyptic, but I hesitated to use that word, in part because of those drawings I've seen of crazy penitents carrying the end is near signs, and in part because of the power of the word itself, apocalypse. I didn't want to use it lightly. And then a friend and fellow activist said, "Derrick, what's it going to take for you to finally call it an apocalypse? Will it take the death of the salmon? The elimination of flocks of passenger pigeons so large they darkened the sky for days at a time, flying 100 kilometers an hour and sounding like rolling thunder? The killing of the great herds of bison? How about the end of the great coral reefs? The extirpation of 200 species per day? 400? 600? Give me a specific threshold, Derrick, a specific point at which you finally use that word." Do you believe that our culture will undergo a voluntary transformation to a sane and sustainable way of living? For decades, I've asked people this question at talks and rallies and libraries, on buses and airplanes, at grocery and hardware stores. I'm a fun guy. Everywhere, and the answers range from emphatic no's to laughter. No one answers yes. Oh, one talk, this one guy raised his hand, he looked around, he said, "Oh, voluntary." No, of course not. We will have a change to a sane and sustainable way of living, by definition, or we won't be living at all. And every cell in my body wants for that to be voluntary, but we all know that it won't be. The next question, for those of us who care about wild nature, how would this understanding that this culture won't voluntarily stop destroying the natural world shift our strategy and our tactics? And the answer? Nobody knows, because we never talk about it. We're all so busy pretending we have hope. I became an environmentalist when I was 7. They put in a subdivision next to where I lived and converted all the meadows into roads, lawns, and white box houses. I remember thinking, even as a kid, they can't keep doing this forever. If they keep doing this, where will the meadowlarks go? Where will the garter snakes go? Where will the cottonwoods go? I didn't have this language, but I understood at 7 years old that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. They say one sign of intelligence is the ability to recognize patterns. So I'm going to lay out a pattern, and let's see if we can recognize it in less than 6,000 years. When you think of Iraq, is the first thing you think of cedar forest so thick that sunlight never touches the ground? One of the first written myths of this culture is Gilgamesh deforesting the hills and valleys of Iraq to build a great city. The Arabian Peninsula was oak savanna. Those trees were cut for export. The Near East was heavily forested. We've all heard of the cedars of Lebanon, and they still have one on their flag. Greece was heavily forested. Plato complained that deforestation was harming water quality, and I'm absolutely sure that the ancient Greek Department of Forestry told them they had to study it a few years to make sure there was actually a correlation. North Africa was heavily forested. Those forests were cut to make the Egyptian and Phoenician navies. Forests precede us, and deserts dog our heels. When I was a baby activist in my 20s and 30s, I noticed a disjuncture between public and private discourse. In private, the activists I knew said they were hanging on by their fingernails, doing whatever they could to protect this or that piece of ground, this or that species, until civilization collapsed, when wild nature would at least have a chance of recovering. But in public, they said, "Oh, we just want to stop this one particular timber sale, stop this one particular destructive activity." For fear of losing credibility, they couldn't say in public that civilization itself functionally destroys land bases. That's what it does. This makes our discourse dysfunctional, dishonest, crazy-making, and ineffective. When people ask, for example, how can we save the salmon, what they're really asking is, how can we save salmon without stopping industrial logging, stopping industrial fishing, removing dams, stopping the murder of the oceans, and stopping global warming? The answer is, you can't. We could do this exercise for species after species. Or let's talk about global warming. What do all the so-called solutions to global warming have in common? They all take industrial civilization as a given, and the natural world is having to conform to civilization. According to these so-called solutions, this way of life cannot be questioned, and its demands for growth, for raw material, for energy, for space are not negotiable. Nature must always be the one to compromise. Civilization is the independent variable, and nature is the dependent variable. They are solving for the wrong variable. This is literally insane in terms of being out of touch with physical reality. Wild nature, physical reality, must always be the independent variable, because without a planet, you don't have any economic/social system whatsoever. It is the foundation of everything. Okay, that's nice, Derrick, but why is this important? Well, the whole world's at stake. And as a dear friend who's both a doctor and an environmentalist always says, correct diagnosis is the first step toward proper treatment. If we can't talk honestly about it, there's no hope of doing whatever right things may or may not be possible. So if I'm going to talk about civilization, I should probably define it. Civilization is not the same as culture. All humans, and undoubtedly a lot of non-humans, have culture. Culture includes our language, stories, ways of knowing, ways of relating, and so on. Civilizations are a specific subset of cultures characterized by the rise of cities. This is defensible both historically, as the rise of civilization is measured by the rise of the first city-states, and it's also defensible linguistically, as the word civilization comes from the root civitatis, meaning state or city. That's fine, Derrick, but what's a city? A city I've defined as a group of people living more or less permanently in one place in densities high enough to require the routine importation of food and other necessities of life. Oh God, that worked, didn't it? I didn't do that on purpose. Two things happen as soon as you require the routine importation of necessities. First, your way of life can never be sustainable. Requiring the importation of a certain resource means you've denuded the landscape of that particular resource. I know we've all been taught that evolution is based on survival of the fittest, which has so often been interpreted for us as survival of the most exploitative, the one who takes the most. But what I know is that those species who've survived in the long run have survived in the long run. And you don't survive in the long run by hyper-exploiting your surroundings. You don't survive in the long run by harming your habitat. You survive in the long run by improving your habitat. The important thing is the survival of the fit between you and your habitat. The important question, do you make your habitat better by your life and your death? How do you think the world got to be so wild and fecund and full of life in the first place? It was by individuals and communities making their habitat more and more healthy by their lives and their deaths. Salmon improve the health of the forest by their lives and deaths. Beavers improve the health of forests and streams by their lives and deaths. Prairie dogs and buffalo improve the health of the prairies by their lives and deaths. Why is it so easy to see among non-humans, but when it comes to humans, we fail to see the necessity of making land bases healthier by our lives and our deaths, by our very existence? But that's how life works. And if you're importing resources, your way of life can never be sustainable because you're taking more from the land base than you're returning. You're harming the land. That can never be sustainable. Second, cities require force because requiring the importation of a resource means trade will never be sufficiently reliable. If the people in the next watershed won't trade you for it, you'll take it. The problem is functional. It doesn't matter what peaceful attitudes individuals within your group hold. If your economy needs oil, you're going to take it. The good news from the perspective of those at the center of empire is that if you've destroyed your land base to convert it to weapons of war, and you've converted your land into raising food only for humans, and thus raised your population beyond carrying capacity, you have a competitive advantage over your neighbors who have not. No one willingly gives up their land, their water, their trees. But since the city has used up its own, it has to go out and get those from somewhere else. Over and over, the pattern is a bloated power center surrounded by conquered colonies from which the center extracts what it wants, until eventually it collapses. As the brilliant Leo Keith puts it, that's the last 10,000 years in a few sentences. So where does this leave us? On a world being killed. The next question, what are we going to do about it? And we have to do something, because if there's anyone left alive 100 years from now, they're going to wonder what the hell was wrong with us that we didn't fight like hell when the world was going down. Those who come after us will only care about whether they can breathe the air, drink the water, whether there are fish in the rivers, whether the land will feed them. They're not going to care if we were nice. They're not going to care how hard we tried. They're not going to care if we built windmills. They're going to care about whether the land can support them. That's all they're going to care about. But maybe before we ask what we're going to do, we need to talk about why we don't do it. More than 60 years, the great philosopher of technology Lewis Mumford, asked why we do not effectively resist. And his answer rings true with every passing day. It has to do with what he called a magnificent bribe, in which, quote, each member of the community may claim every material advantage, every intellectual and emotional stimulus he may desire, in quantities hardly available hitherto even for a restricted minority: food, housing, swift transportation, instantaneous communication, medical care, entertainment, education. We are, right now, literally in a palace. And every single person in the audience and every single person watching this on the internet, for however long it's on the internet, every single person has more luxuries than the people who built this palace, than the emperor, the king. We have, every one of us has what are called ghost slaves, 2,000 ghost slaves each in fossil fuel energy. It's extraordinary what we have, access to ice cream 24/7. Oh my God, does anybody know if the Nuggets won last night? The Denver Nuggets in the basketball? I was kind of wondering. Anyway, but on one condition, this is back to Mumford, that one must not merely ask for nothing that the system doesn't provide, but likewise agree to take everything offered, duly processed and fabricated, homogenized and equalized in the precise quantities that the system, rather than the person, requires. Once one opts for the system, no further choice remains. In a word, if one surrenders one's life at source, society will give back as much of it as can be mechanically graded, quantitatively multiplied, and collectively manipulated and magnified. Once we accept this bribe of access to ice cream 24/7, access to all these luxuries, hot showers, once this bribe is accepted, and with the aid of new forms of mass control, its panoply of tranquilizers and sedatives and aphrodisiacs, could democracy in any form survive? The question is absurd. Life itself will not survive. End quote. So most talks on ecological problems end one or more of four ways, each of which has its own problems. The first is by suggesting the solution is to simply limit one's personal participation in the destructive system, either by reducing one's consumption or walking away. I'm not a fan of this approach, primarily since it does nothing to stop the horrors. One can feel better about oneself for having reduced one's participation, and there are cases where for moral reasons one shouldn't participate. I don't, for example, visit zoos or use pornography. But these actions don't create social change. Me not going to zoos and me not using porn doesn't shut down those industries. There are no personal solutions to social problems. Another standard end is to suggest a form of acceptance or accommodation of the horror of it all, so we can maintain inner peace as the world crumbles all around us. I've seen books that present, any number of books that present the murder of the planet as an opportunity for spiritual growth. That repulses me. Any spiritual growth that doesn't lead us to fight for life on this planet isn't spiritual growth. It's another excuse for inaction, once again using nature as a resource, in this case, a spiritual resource. Again, there are no personal solutions to social problems. A third option is to provide a checklist of actions. Things like call a representative, vote, donate to or volunteer at this or that organization. And my response to this one's complicated. My work is about sparking a resistance movement to stop this culture from killing the planet. And that resistance movement doesn't happen on its own. We need to work to bring it into being. So yes, I want for people to act. My concern is twofold. The first is that the suggestions are always incommensurate with the threats. A great example was Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. For 90 minutes, he discussed and understated the danger of global warming. Then his solutions: inflate your tires, change your light bulbs. Nothing about questioning corporate power, of course. Nothing about questioning a growth economy. Nothing about power at all. Nothing about removing critical infrastructure. Nothing about protecting wild nature. I'd want for my suggestions to be more meaningful than consumer and personal choices. And I always hesitate to make suggestions to people I don't know. How do I know what another person's strengths are or weaknesses? How do I know what that person loves to do? When people I don't know ask what they should do to protect the earth, I always respond by asking them a series of questions. First, what do you love? Whatever it is, it's under assault. Defend it. Everyone loves some place or some creature. Everyone has some atrocity they yearn and burn to end. So do it. The good thing about everything being so messed up is no matter where you look, there's good work to be done. The next is, what are your gifts and how can you use them in the service of the land? We all have different gifts. I can write books. I can't write good press releases. I can't do accounting. Some small organizations are starved for accountants or people who can work with computers. I can barely do emails, and I hate the fucking things. Some people have gifts for organizing. I don't. So find out what are your gifts and then use them. What are the largest, most pressing problems you can help to solve using the gifts that are unique to you in all the universe? I could not have done what you've done. I couldn't have organized this thing. It would have been like everybody would have shown up on a different day, and this is like somebody high jumping 12 feet or something. It's just not physically possible. You have accomplished a miracle. One reason I write my books is that no one else is doing it. I know people doing great work saving pangolins, saving prairie dogs, saving beavers, wolves, buffalo, migratory songbirds, protecting land, restoring habitat, simply because no one else is doing it. I have a good friend. She just got sick of seeing all these prairie dogs killed, and she's a wonderful activist. She just said, nobody else is doing it. Looks like it's my job. So find what you love and fight like hell, using every gift you've got to defend your beloved. Like another thing that's disappearing, and I'm so glad you're doing this, is long-form discourse is disappearing. Independent bookstores are disappearing. Fight for those if that's your issue. The fourth typical ending I've seen in talks or books on social or ecological problems, and I have to admit I'm guilty of all of these, including with this talk, consists of having spent the talk describing the horrors we face, then expressing with as much optimism and sincerity as one can muster a vague hope that somehow good will triumph over evil, and that somehow this culture won't kill the planet. Note the passive voice. But given that every biological indicator is going the wrong direction, given that this culture has been able to pollute every part of the planet, given that it violates even the deepest folds of the ocean, given that human supremacism is not only not going away, but it's in ascendancy, not only is a vague hope insufficient, especially given what's at stake, but I see no evidence it's warranted. When I think of environmentalism, I think of a body wheeled into an emergency room bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Doctors and nurses work feverishly to stop the bleeding and to give infusions. They do everything but the most important thing of all. They don't stop the madman continuing to stab the patient. All that said, I have one thing I'd like for you to do right now and every day. I'm begging you to transfer your loyalty away from the dominant economic and social system and to wild nature. Two examples may make clear the merest beginnings of what I'm getting at. One is a few years ago, George Monbiot expressed the moment he realized small-scale wind and solar won't effectively power a large-scale economy, which is true, and realized he needed to support nuclear energy, which is crap. He asked, quote, how do we drive our textile mills, brick kilns, blast furnaces, and electric railways, not to mention advanced industrial processes, end quote. Let's change a few words and see how different it sounds. How do the industrialists drive their textile mills, brick kilns, blast furnaces, and electric railways, not to mention advanced industrial processes? They're not mine, they're not ours, and we don't need to power them. The Earth especially doesn't need them. The last thing the Earth needs is another blast furnace. The next way to make this clear is, if space aliens were coming down from outer space and they were doing to the planet what industrial civilization is doing to the planet, bathing the world in endocrine disruptors, changing the climate, cutting down forests, wiping out biodiversity, vacuuming the oceans, bringing vertebrate evolution to an end, putting microplastics and flame retardant in every mother's breast milk, if there were space aliens doing that, I think we would all know exactly what to do. If you change your loyalty away from this economic system and social system and to wild nature, everything changes. What you do next becomes merely a matter of strategy and tactics, not one of divided loyalties. You fight to protect the beings you love while trying to maintain a system that's been destroying the Earth from the beginning. My friend, the doctor and environmentalist John Osborne, says the reason he protects wild nature is that, quote, as things become increasingly chaotic, I want to make sure that some evolutionary doors remain open. If bull trout are around in 10 years, they may be around in 1,000, but if they're gone in 10 years, they're gone forever. If a patch of old-growth forest is standing in 10 years, it may be standing in 1,000. If it's gone in 10 years, in human terms, it's gone forever. We need to say and mean extinction, not on my watch. To take us back to the beginning, we are like my friends and comrades when I was a baby activist, holding on by our fingernails, protecting this or that creature, this or that piece of land until civilization collapses and life can return. But we're doing it in public, asking others of the same to join us. Always ask, if Danube sturgeon could take on human manifestation and act in the interest of their species, what would they do? What gifts of yours would they use in defense of themselves and others of their species? Same for pond bats, brown bears, timber wolves. If they could take on human manifestation, what would they do to protect their homes? My optimism, such as it is, comes from the fact that life wants to live. The body has tremendous capacity for self-healing, so long as it isn't pushed too far. So long as we stop the madman who's stabbing it, no one and nothing can survive infinite assault. At some point, the body, the species, the biome dies. But if we stop the damage soon enough, life may eventually recover. Chernobyl, one of the worst nuclear disasters in history, ends up being less harmful than the day-to-day activities of agriculture and industry. That stabbing by the madman. Because extractive activities were stopped, wolves are back, beavers are back, Przewalski's horses are back. If we push the Earth too far, we will effectively kill the planet, or at least all megafauna larger than rats. But if we stop civilization soon enough, there is a chance for life to recover. Life wants to live. And I want to end with the tradition of the Cheyenne dog soldiers called the picket pin and stake. Before a battle, a few of the bravest dog soldiers would be chosen to wear sashes of tanned skins called dog ropes. Attached to each dog rope was a picket pin, normally used to tether horses. During battle, the pin would be driven into the ground as a mark of resolve. Once the pin was driven, the dog soldier was staked to that piece of ground, even to his death. Retreat was no longer an option. The pin could only be removed when everyone was again safe or when another dog soldier relieved him of his duty. It is time. I have driven my picket pin. I am staked out and willing to give in no more. Where will you drive your own picket stake? Where will you choose to make your stand? Give me a threshold, a specific point at which you finally stop running, at which you finally fight back. Stand with me. Stand and fight. I am one, we would be two. Two more might join and we would be four. When four more join, we will be eight. And we will be 8 people fighting whom others will join, and then more people and more. Stand and fight. The questions before each of us now are, what are your gifts and how can you use them in the service of your land base? What can you do? What does your land base most need from you? How can you achieve it? What do you want to do? And right now, perhaps the most important of all, what are you willing to do? Thank you.